Welcome back. So let's talk about the economy. On Thursday this week, the Nigeria Bureau of Statistics told us that our GDP grew by 5.01%. That's year on year for the second quarter of 2021. But I was thinking, and a couple of other people asked me, what does this mean?
To the common man,
yes,
how does it affect my life?
Yes, GDP, gross domestic product. Yes.
Food is still expensive.
What does it mean? Because I bought, does it have any relationship with the beans I bought last week that was 2,500 for paint bucket and is now 3,000? Is there any relationship? We don't know, right? So let's go to the economists who will tell us more about this. We have the partner and chief economist, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Mr. Andrew Nevin in our Abuja studio. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. And on Zoom, joining us online is a senior economist, Nigerian Economic Summit Group, Wilson Erumebo. Thank you so much for your time this morning. Let me start with you, Mr. Erumebo. So let's break it down for Nigerians. What does this mean, this growth in the GDP year on year? What does it mean to,
in
or
real
should
terms,
it mean to the ordinary Nigerian?
Well, thank you for having me. It's interesting to be here, and I followed your conversation. I was almost laughing, like when you said, you know, the prices of goods are still high in the market.
You know, that's what the people want to hear. If you say the economy, grew or the GDP grew, they want to know how is it growing and
how is it affecting me?
Not to be changing positively.
Exactly. So GDP basically measures the outputs that an economy produces, you know, in a year or in a quarter, you know, and there are many other economic indicators, you know, that track other areas or different aspects of the economy. You know, inflation is one, you know, unemployment, poverty. But GDP is, you know, one of the most popular. And so most times when people hear that it increases, they expect that, have our lives, should we not see this, you know, impacting our lives? But usually that's not the case in most of the time. You know, if you look at history and you look at countries that have grown and high and consistent growth rates, you know, for it to be able to impact people, unemployment, and other aspects of our lives. But what basically this means is that compared to the second quarter of last year, we've seen that the economy expanded by 5%. And of course, you'd remember that in the second quarter of last year, we had the COVID-19 and we implemented the lockdown, you know, which meant that, you know, companies that produce goods, particularly those that produce non-essential items, you know, could not produce output. And GDP here, we're measuring quarter 2 of this year versus quarter 2 of last year. So if you are comparing a period where economic activities has come to life and people, all the lockdown rules have been relaxed, with a period where there was lockdown, of course, output was lower in quarter 2 last year, which meant, I mean, we had a minus 6.1% decline. So that's basically why you saw this very high growth rate, you know, in GDP. But then if you compare with the last quarter, so if you look at what was GDP in the value of GDP in Q2 versus the value of GDP in Q1, in fact, you would realize that with the economy, output declined, which meant that the economy was even much better in the first 3 months of this year than in April to June. So that's something I think also needs to be paid attention to, you know, as opposed to only the 5%.
Okay. Mr. Neville, would you kindly just explain to us how GDP can improve in an economy where many small and medium-scale industries wound up as a result of the pandemic?
Well, I mean, in a way, I think Wilson put it very well. It's just a little bit of a rebound effect here. So from the second quarter of 2019 to the second quarter of 2020, the economy shrunk 6%. And so from the second quarter of 2020 to the second quarter of 2021, it grew 5%. So it's still 1% smaller than 2 years ago. And of course, we've had population growth of probably about 6% in that time. So from a GDP perspective, I mean, Nigerians are still considerably poor. The 5% looks like a good number, and it is better number, but we're not back to where we need to be. I mean, we've had GDP growth below population growth in 2015, in 2016, in 2017, in 2018, in 2019, in 2020, in 2021. I hope not again in 2022. But I mean, so we have been getting poorer and poorer per capita for a very long time. So it's not a big surprise. We have the sort of the poverty numbers that we're all aware of, the unemployment numbers, particularly among the youth, that we're all aware of. So while this single number is okay, it doesn't mean the economy is in great shape yet, though I'm optimistic for the future.
It's the real GDP, talking about the quarter on quarter, it grew at minus 0.79% in the second quarter of 2021. What does that mean too?
Actually, we need to take a little bit of a step back here. I mean, we put these numbers out, these GDP numbers, and we talk about them as though they're accurate. But I mean, we have more than 50% of the economy is informal. It's not clear how much the GDP captures the informal economy. So I'm not sure we should actually put too much reliance on some of these GDP numbers. Now, you know, the Nigerian Bureau of Statistics, and of course, Dr. Kali has just retired, as your show is showing at the bottom, and being replaced. I mean, he and the department are the finest civil servants in the country. But you know, in the conditions that we're in, getting an accurate number for GDP is not a simple task. So when we get this 5% number and then we endlessly repeat it as if it's reality, I worry about that. I mean, I think that we have a need to kind of go a little bit deeper, given that we have such an informal economy. So let me give you another number, for example. The World Bank just said that remittances in 2020 declined from 25 billion to about 18 billion, or declined by 25% in 2020 versus 2019. I mean, I don't believe that number. The chairwoman of NIDCOM doesn't believe that number, because of course people are putting more remittances through informal channels because of the gap between the parallel rate and the official rate. I mean, we're talking about GDP growth that's slow, but cement sales are up 30% on that. So I caution all our listeners today and the policymakers not to read too much into statistics that are, you know, very difficult to calculate. And then to go back to the question about inflation, I mean, it's a huge concern in the country. But again, we repeat numbers that are not really, it's not clear if there's a difference between 17.55 inflation or 18.221 inflation. People talk about going up or going down. I mean, at the end of the day, 50% of Nigerians spend more than 50% of their income on food. So what they care about is what is the price of food in their local market. So again, you know, I really caution everyone not to lead too much into the statistics. What we need to focus on more is what's happening on the ground in terms of poverty levels, in terms of unemployment, et cetera. But please don't read too much into the GDP numbers.
So we went into recession in 2020, and early this year we came out of a recession, and somehow our GDP has managed to improve. But what does it mean to the man on the street? How is it going to affect his standard of living?
From my perspective, we've never really come out of a recession, right? I mean, we have such a high population growth for us. If we don't have a minimum of 5% or 6% or 8% growth, we're not getting better off. So for us, 1 or 2% growth that we've had the last few years is still a recession because of the population growth on that. So, I mean, the average man on the street sees the effects of this. I mean, we all understand the poverty number. We all understand the unemployment number, as I mentioned, particularly among the young people. So we're just not seeing enough economic growth. I mean, we have been very consistent at PwC for the last 6 or 7 years. We need growth of 6 to 8%. We're getting growth of 1 or 2%. I mean, the central bank governor has come out and said he thinks the economy should be able to grow at double digits. I mean, it's perfectly possible. China has done it. India has done it. Nigeria can do it as well. But we continue to have this 1 or 2% growth in the headline GDP, so we continue to get poorer and poorer per capita. You know, what's the basic reason for it? From our perspective, there's one fundamental thing that's driving this low growth, which is people are not investing enough in Nigeria. So the level of investment, if you take a country like India, which is doing well economically, you need to reinvest about 28 to 30% of your GDP every year to get 6 to 8% growth. Nigeria is only investing about 17 to 19% of it, so almost only half of what's required. So under those circumstances, we'll continue to get growth of 1 or 2%. So we'll continue to get poorer and poorer per capita. We'll have increasing unemployment, increasing poverty. So the fundamental question that we would like policymakers to think about is, Nigeria is the biggest economic opportunity on the planet. It has the most potential for every business on it. So why are people not investing in Nigeria? Why are Nigerians not investing? Why is the diaspora not investing? Why are other groups outside not investing? And unless we address that fundamental issue, we're going to continue to have this growth that's below the population growth. And as I said, 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, maybe 2022. How many years can we have declining income per capita, declining GDP per capita before we have a social crisis? And of course, we've seen in the last 18 months, the security situation worsen on many dimensions across the country, and it's very worrying.
Let me go to Mr. Rumebo. Of course, that question Alero asked earlier was actually for you, but it's fine. Mr. Nevin said that 50% of Nigerians spend 50% of their income on food. Is that something to worry about?
Yes, in a way, because if you look at the inflation figures and the weight attached to goods, you'd realize that a lot of us, a lot of Nigerians spend so much of their income on food, and this was even backed by consumption expenditure, which showed that, a consumption expenditure survey, which showed that the other 43 was on non-food items. What that basically means is that, people are still, looking at survival. So the moment an economy grows and expands and you begin to see some type of development, ideally you should see a migration from spending so much of your income on food to non-food items. Let's look at poverty, for instance. When the NBS did the poverty survey in 2019, and you'd realize that 40% of Nigerians live below the poverty line. Now, what's the poverty line in the first place? So you'd have a case where if you spend below 137,000 naira in a year, it means you are categorized as poor. Now, if you break that down into a daily rate, you have 380 naira per day. Now, you can imagine spending 380 naira per day, and it means that below that, it means that you are poor. If you raise the bar a little bit more to maybe 400, it means that so many Nigerians will then fall into poverty. So what that also means is that in the past couple of years or months or years, you've seen how prices have gone up. What 380 naira can do in 2019 is not what it can do now as we speak. In fact, it could be up to something close to 600 or thereabout. So it means that even many more Nigerians, have fallen into poverty, especially because of the COVID-19. So the World Bank estimated that in 2020, 7 million more Nigerians has fallen into poverty, which means we could be having something close to 90 million people living below the poverty line. So that tells you, explains much of why we spend a lot on food, because people are basically thinking of how they can survive. It's when you are doing well, you can start thinking of on other items like, travel, tourism, and all that.
Okay, let's look at if you would talk to the government as it is, and maybe those that are in charge of the economy are listening to you now, which areas would you say they should focus on to ensure that the economy, would grow in a way that it will positively affect the people?
Well, one of the things that is very important, linking this also to GDP. I don't think GDP is, a useless indicator, as it were. Perhaps part of why we've not seen a translation as far as GDP is concerned with the real reality of the people is the sectors that drive growth. So GDP is made up of sectors. In Nigeria, we have, 18 major sectors. So if you have a case where just a few sectors, about 3 sectors, are the ones contributing the larger share to this GDP, obviously what that means is that people will not feel the impact, because again, some of those sectors that have much weight and contribute to the growth we see are sectors that necessarily may not employ as much people as they should. So while looking at trade, I mean, before this quarter, for instance, this is the first time trade has posted a positive growth in a very, very long time. While looking at a sector like manufacturing, which employs close to about 5 million people, according to the latest NBS survey in 2017. So my thoughts on sectors that can, lift people out of poverty, sectors that can employ people, sectors that have very strong forward and backward linkages. So for instance, and some of these sectors is not just about putting money and giving people cash. No, it's about implementing reforms that can open them up to investment. Dr. Andrew Nevin just mentioned that we're not investing as much as we should in Nigeria. I mean, if you look at FDI, foreign direct investments into Nigeria, it's just $1 billion in 2020. I mean, Indonesia recorded $29 billion worth of investment. And this is a country that is very, very similar to Nigeria, both in terms of diversity, population, resources, and all that. I mean, so if they are getting 29 times more FDIs than us, then it means that there's something we need to do, perhaps, addressing some of the constraints relating to doing business in Nigeria.
Mr. Nevin, so let me pick it up from where Mr. Rumebo stopped, talking about foreign direct investment. He mentioned we had just $1 billion in 2020. What more do we need to do to ensure that we have, more people coming in to invest in Nigeria?
Well, I mean, I think that there have been real efforts on PEBEC and the ease of doing business there, but I think we haven't really made quite enough progress on that. And Wilson's exactly right. I mean, the 1 billion is really not a very good number. Of course, it's affected by COVID because the FDI investors can't travel so much. But still, I mean, even if we go back historically, we haven't been getting enough foreign direct investment. So, we have a number of issues. But I think that despite the efforts of PEBEC, and Dr. Jamoke, who heads up PEBEC, is really a national heroine and has done an amazing job. But I think that the thing that we have not done in the country is take some hard structural decisions around that. It's still too complex, too many MDAs, too many overlapping jurisdictions, too many costs in many in doing business. So it's confusing for investors. And of course, Yewande Sadiku, who's another national heroine who heads up NIPC, would say, capital is cowardly. So if they're confused or they feel there's too much complexity, they're not sure about exactly which agency they need to be talking to be able to expedite things, or a relationship between the federal government and the state government, they're not going to come. And that's in fact what's happened. So we've advocated for a number of years that we need to take some bolder decisions. I mean, there was the Oren Shea report in 2013. His Excellency President Buhari last year, or a little over a year ago, assented to it, but we still haven't seen positive action to kind of streamline the federal government activities. I also wanted to add, though, from a sector viewpoint, I mean, PwC has been very clear about for 4 or 5 years that the number one sector, if we want to reduce poverty, if we want to reduce unemployment in this country, is real estate. Because at the end of the day, real estate, as Wilson says, has all those backward and forward linkages on it. It has the local building materials. People buy a house, they furnish it over time. It drives demand throughout the economy. You obviously have the carpenters, you have the electricians, you have the masons, you have the caterers, you have the laborers, you have the higher value added things. So real estate has to work as a sector. And unfortunately, it hasn't worked as well as we can. So no other sector can compensate for it. But we've always put that at the top of the list as the number one sector to kind of really address Nigeria's issues. And of course, real estate has questions around the Land Use Act. It has about the mortgage system, which need to be worked on as part of that.
Mr. Rumebo, for the first time in decades, NMPC released its audited account, and it is also considering an IPO. Is this likely to affect GDP growth in any way?
Well, in a way, I mean, if you look at GDP, I think part of what we could be looking at, I mean, not just even NNPC, the passage of the Petroleum Industry Act. I mean, those are this is something that they've been pushing for decades, and now it's happening. I mean, it has happened. Even though, I mean, there are still concerns from different stakeholders, but the consensus generally, the mood is more like, let's just even see what we can do with this. How can we start moving forward? So beyond the NIPC, there are also so many reforms that would come to the industry. And I think part of what has been missing since is that sense of optimism, confidence level on the sector in particular. And of course, if you merge that with the OPEC quotas and all that, I mean, right now, crude oil prices are even quite high, but we're not seeing the impact of that, particularly on our reserves, because of the quota and so many other challenges relating to production. So I think there's some sense of optimism, oil and gas sector and all of that. So yes, in summary, I think those things would, in a way, impact GDP in the subsequent quarters. Perhaps, maybe not just immediately, but maybe looking at 3, 4, 5 quarters to come.
You've mentioned that oil prices have gone up in a way, and it's not really reflecting in our reserve. But in the oil sector, the NBS also said that the average daily oil production stood at 1.61 million barrels per day in the second quarter of 2021, and this value was a little lower than what we had earlier, that is about 1.81 million barrels per day. Let's talk more about, diversification, the non-oil sector. How do we improve on that?
Well, yes, we've written a lot at the NESG on how we can diversify, and to put it in context, diversification doesn't necessarily mean we have to kill oil, or we have to ensure that oil outputs decline so that non-oil can grow. No, what we're basically saying is, I mean, as much as you pay attention to crude oil, you put up the enabling policies and act, which we've done with the PIA. Let's also, direct this attention, to the non-oil sector. I mean, by every standard, if you look at what Nigeria produces, our non-oil exports, and compare that to our non-oil GDP, it's less than 2%, in 2020. Even in 2019, when things were still a bit much better, it was less than 2%. So it means that we are not even producing enough for export. I mean, even for some commodities in the domestic market, how much more export? And we've come up with several reports focusing on the manufacturing sector. There are so many subsectors within the manufacturing sector that we think if Nigeria unlocks those sectors and provide reforms, that enable investment into those sectors, we will then see a lot of the impact on the common people that, Alero has stressed over time. Because, of course, let me just pick one subsector, for instance, the leather industry. Now, this is one sector that is very huge in terms of global market size. Nigeria, has the potential to be able to, feed some of these developing countries and developed countries with high quality leather materials. I mean, we've seen some success stories of a few manufacturers in Nigeria that export leather to so many different African countries. In short, I participated at last year's Lagos Leather Fair, as a speaker, and it was so interesting to see how much people are investing in the industry at a small scale, even to produce high quality leather. But there's still a challenge. There's still so many challenges facing this sector. I mean, government coming in, providing training and support, to players in the sector, ensuring that we have some level of standards, across board within the sector. So many areas that the government can put in. I mean, there's cassava processing into industrial starch is still a great area of opportunity. So across almost all sectors and sub-activities that can be strengthened, and government policy, government focus, and government investment coming in. Lastly is on security. I think that's one big issue that perhaps we need to urgently address to be able to attract investment into some of these sectors that I mentioned.
Dr. Nevin, Mr. Rumabo spoke at length about the manufacturing sector, and you also spoke about unemployment, especially of the youth in Nigeria. How can we focus on manufacturing such that more factories open and provide employment and thereby increase our GDP?
Let me go back to the oil point on it. I mean, we've moved beyond oil. So if you look at the numbers here, I mean, we produce 1.6 million barrels a day, but we consume 400,000 barrels a day. So we have 1.2 million that's effective to support the economy that we're not using ourselves. It's 400 million barrels a year, over 200 million Nigerians, less than 2 barrels per person per year. We're not an oil economy, and the flows into the, even from a FX viewpoint, the flows into the country, the biggest flow into the country is not oil, it's the diaspora remittances. And the term that we use is our biggest export is not oil, our biggest export is Nigerian brains on that. And in terms of exporting, what we're saying the right strategy should be is let's focus on exporting Nigerian brains but without people necessarily leaving Nigeria. So when you took it, I mean, Wilson mentioned the leather industry, and of course there are huge barriers to exporting. The infrastructure that we have, the port system we have, the way the customs works, all of those things are barriers. But we're already exporting services because you don't have to deal with any of that. We export business processing outsourcing services. So for example, Mal Hassan, who's another Nigerian heroine, is the founder and CEO of Outsource Global. She has 1,200 seats in northern Nigeria of people exporting services, business processing, outsourcing, and other sorts of services to multinationals in the U.S. and the U.K. She is earning FX for her for Nigeria. The people are very well paid university grads who've got good jobs within Nigeria. And what we're finding is that this is more and more possible with COVID. So you hear stories both as individuals who are getting hired from Europe, for example, but staying in Nigeria, but also expanding companies that are able to export the services. So that's what we like to focus on, and that includes these sorts of BPO services. It includes financial services. So you've got Access marching across the continent, you've got UBA marching across the continent, InterSwitch, Flutterwave as examples of exporting services. And of course we have the one that has probably the most potential, which are the cultural services. So you go back to this point about not being an oil economy. So in the latest statistics that this GDP release, the oil sector was only 7.5% of the economy. Cultural activities, cultural services are over 8%. So no one says we're a cultural economy, but that's what we should be exporting. So things like Nollywood, things like the music industry. People are aware that we had 2 Grammy Award winners. And so that's the strategy that we're advocating on that. Let's export Nigerian brains, but keeping the brains in Nigeria. So when you say manufacturing, yeah, I mean, obviously every sector in Nigeria should grow, but that would not be our primary focus at this point in time because there are so many barriers to it. And if you think about manufacturing, take a simple example. Let's say that we wanted to manufacture air conditioning units or fans, low-end manufacturing. Who would we displace? I mean, we'd have to put in the entire business system, the entire supply chain together for that. We'd have to import some parts, re-export it. Are we going to export it to China? I don't think so. Are we going to export it to India? I don't think so. Are we going to export it to Europe? They have a shrinking population on that. So I don't think that our development path is going to be the same one as you saw, say, in South Korea or Thailand or Vietnam, where you have starting at low-end manufacturing and moving up the value chain. Let's jump to the highest value addition, the thing that really kind of drives wealth in the country, which is exporting services, because we're already good at it. So we coined a term for this, which is Nigeria's the barbell economy. Why the barbell economy? Because we export the lowest value-added thing in the world, which is oil, crude oil, and we export the highest value-added thing, which is Nigerian brains, and that's the structure of our economy. But let's not go backwards. Let's grow the part that exports Nigerian brains, and that's the way we're going to make Nigeria more and more wealthy.
Let me touch on manufacturing that you also touched on, Mr. Nevin. We need to do more in that area. But of course, those that are in that sector, they've complained, of course, different things. taxation,
multiple taxation,
taxation, infrastructure, power. They say the cost of running things in the country, so much so that some of our products, in comparison with the ones that will come from our neighboring countries, they can't stand in terms of pricing. How do we address that?
Well, but that's exactly my point. I mean, if you think of kind of your basic economic theory here, you want to focus on what you have a comparative advantage in. So what does Nigeria have a comparative advantage in? Well, we're blessed here. We have a comparative advantage in the highest value-added goods, which are services. As I said, financial services, outsourcing, coding as a service, business processing, outsourcing, cultural industries. That's where we have a comparative advantage, and we're already exporting. So let's focus on that. The idea that we're going to become the low-cost producer for what table fans, as I discussed, or other kinds of simple manufacturing, I think that's an illusion. And as I said, I think we're copying an old model of development that worked in South Korea, it worked in Vietnam, it worked, of course, in China. But that's not our development path. Let's choose a development path that's appropriate for Nigeria, given the way the modern world works and given Nigeria's comparative advantages. And we are clearly have a comparative advantage in exporting these services and exporting Nigerian brains. So let's not try to create policies that really are a successful strategy for South Korea, but is not appropriate, fit for purpose for Nigeria in 2021.
Mr. Rumebo, talking about exporting, recently NAFDAC raised the concern that some of our grains that we export to the US, some of the European countries, are being rejected. What more do you think we can do to ensure that this produce, they come in high quality, enough for not just exports, but for local consumption too?
Well, it's simple. It's just standards and enforcing those standards. And I think that's where we've not really, we've not done much, across. I mean, I've had several cases of, just a typical example of someone who produces a particular product. I think it was tomatoes and co. Very nice, big, very reddish and co. But when someone shared this story, when they eventually, found out, they noticed that, the source of, water to the farm, was coming from a very, not really a nice place. I don't want to mention, but it tells you that, some of those things we consume, even within Nigeria, are we talking about our yam, our beans, and all of that? Some of these things, have some chemical content in them. We've seen several examples. I was at a conference where someone was talking about even yam. How do you plant it? We've seen cases where people apply some of those chemicals on the root of the product, and ideally, it should be by the side. So when you do that, what that means is the chemical content goes into the particular product, and we consume that locally. Who measures what's the safety of our gari that we consume, or our beans, or our rice? It doesn't have to be that it's when we export it to other countries, they reject it, and then they tell us that it has some content, or our beans usually, it would have very high aflatoxin content in them. We don't have to get to that level to export to other countries and they tell us what's in our product. How much of that enforcement is going on locally? Of course, we have a very large informal sector, but are there ways we can start looking at, enforcing some of these standards? On paper, we have them. We have the content for some of these commodities. So what can we do to strengthen agencies like NAFDAC, for instance, SON and Co, to be able to ensure that our products have the right standards, even for us locally, before we start talking about exports? I also want to speak to the interesting point, it's shaping a new narrative right now. As he was speaking, I was thinking, perhaps maybe this is something good, focusing more on the service part of it. But I think the AFCFTA, presents a very golden opportunity for Nigeria. The fact that Africa is coming together, or has come together, this deal has started in January. It presents an opportunity for us to produce even more and export to other African countries. Especially given that there is the rule of origin, which states that if you produce some of these goods, locally, you will be exempted from those tariffs and codes. So it's not necessarily you produce something in China and it qualifies for free tariff. So I think that presents an opportunity. If you travel to many of these African countries, particularly the French-speaking countries, you will see how much they rely so much on imports. I mean, why can't we supply some of these goods to them? I mean, we have a very strong advantage across so many products that they consume, that is consumed within Africa. Just in Aba here, you'd be surprised how much they feed neighboring countries in terms of production of shoes, bags, and so many of those other items. So I think there's still an opportunity in manufacturing. And especially when you look at the structure of our imports, you'd realize that Nigeria spent a lot more importing manufactured goods, than importing, so many other products. I mean, we spend 15% of our imports, importing mineral product, which is petroleum product and all that. Those are products that are classified under manufacturing, and those are things that we can easily produce here, rather than feeding other countries, providing jobs in other countries, and spending so much of our FX importing some of these items. There's been effort in the past few years, but I think, yeah.
Yes, so you've just said it. So we shouldn't create jobs outside of the country for other people. We should be able to manufacture some of these things that are imported here. Thank you so much for your time this morning. We've been having a chat with the senior economist, Nigerian Economic Summit Group, Mr. Wilson Erumebo, and of course, a partner and chief economist, PricewaterhouseCoopers. He joined us from our Abuja studio, Mr. Andrew Nevin. Thank you so much. We'll be back in a short moment and we'll continue with the conversation on Sunrise. To stay with us.